So now that I've ended my Philosophy of Mind series and my Materialism series, I will now be taking a swing at biblical arguments. The first on the list is an interesting video by IP, Inspiring Philosophy, on the supposedly Jewish Trinitarian beliefs. So let's take a look.
A common belief is the doctrine of the Trinity is a total Christian invention. Before the rise of Christianity, early Jews never thought of or considered the idea of a multi-personal God, and only thought of God as a unified single figure. Christians either made up the Trinity to explain how Jesus revealed himself, or they stole it from paganism. But this is simply not true, and if you study early Jewish writings, you will see that many authors wrestled with the idea of three powers in the Old Testament, who all seem to be God.
It appears that what IP has done is interpreted the henotheistic and monolatrist theology that pervades the Hebrew Bible as an allusion to the Trinity. In Genesis 30, Jacob, or Yaqub if you prefer, wrestles with a being who goes by the name El Elyon, or God Most High. This is not meant to be Yahweh. After Jacob has the dream of the ladder going to heaven in Genesis 28, he erects a structure of stones called in the Hebrew a matzebah. In Deuteronomy, Yahweh will ask the Israelites to destroy the temples of the pagans, their Baal, Asherah, and matzebah. Why would God ask someone to participate in a ritual? Or rather, why would someone participate in a ritual that was obviously meant for pagans in the first place?
We looked at several of these passages and demonstrated how the Trinity doctrine was not an invention of the New Testament, but was taught overwhelmingly throughout the Old Testament as well. Many ancient Jews and Jewish scholars today have recognized this, like Jewish scholar Benjamin Sommer.
This is actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea, that is an old Semitic idea that is popping up again among those Jews who were the founders of Christianity. And we Jews have always tended to sort of make fun of the Trinity. Oh, how can there be three that is one? Really, they're pagans. They're not real monotheists like we Jews are, or like the Muslims are. Those Christians are really pagan. But I think that what we're seeing from what I've been saying in the past couple days is that, the idea of the Trinity, that there is this one God who manifests itself in three different ways, that's actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea that can function in a polytheistic context, as it did for the Babylonians and the Canaanites, but it can also function in a monotheistic context, as it does, I think, in the J and the E texts and some of the other texts that we were looking at. In fact, to say that 3 is 1, heck, the Kabbalah is going to go further than that. They say 10 is 1, and actually when you get to Lurianic Kabbalah, and there's the idea that within each of the Sefirot, each of the 10 Sefirot has 10 Sefirot within it, so that we've got 100 different Sefirot, really. We're taking this reasoning much, much farther than the Christians did. So actually, one of the more radical conclusions that I came to, much to my own surprise, when I was writing this book, and this is not at all what I had intended to do, because in various ways that we could discuss if you're interested, I'm actually rather uncomfortable with my own conclusion here, but as a scholar, I gotta call them as I see them. One of the conclusions that I came to my shock, when I finished this book, is that we Jews have no theological objection to the doctrine of the Trinity. I came to the conclusion that we Jews have no theological right to object to the Trinity. Theologically, I think that the model of the Trinity is an old, ancient Near Eastern idea that shows up in the Tanakh, and that in a different way shows up in Jewish mysticism as well.
As Dr. Sommer points out, there are clear passages in the Old Testament where there are different persons or powers of God who are distinct, yet still the one God. Early Jews also recognized this nature about God and wrote concerning it. To be fair, not all of them interpreted these passages the same way a Christian Trinitarian does, but they do recognize the existence of other powers alongside God and multiple powers that are all God. For example, in the Talmud, there is a passage where the author is debating with a Jewish Christian who pointed to Exodus 24:1, where God says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. The Jewish Christian was arguing, it is odd that God said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord," instead of "Come up to me," and it is likely they were different persons of one God.
So let me stop you right there, IP, about your claim about the angel of the Lord. This angel clearly cannot be God, as multiple times in the Hebrew Bible, this is Yahweh described as sending this angel to kill, for example, the firstborn of Egypt, or to make Balaam's donkey talk in Numbers 22, or to kill over 50,000 Syrians in one night at the Battle of Sennacherib in Isaiah 37.
As Dr. Summer points out, there are clear passages in the Old Testament where there are different persons or powers of God who are distinct, yet still the one God. Early Jews also recognized this nature about God and wrote concerning it. To be fair, not all of them interpreted these passages the same way a Christian Trinitarian does.
No shit.
But they do recognize the existence of other powers alongside God and multiple powers that are all God. For example, in the Talmud, there is a passage where the author is debating with a Jewish Christian.
A Jewish Christian or a Messianic Jew?
Who pointed to Exodus 24:1, where God says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel." The Jewish Christian was arguing, it is odd that God said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord," instead of "Come up to me," and it is likely they were different persons of one God.
Yahweh refers to himself to single himself out from the other deities that the Israelites believed existed. In Exodus 24 verse 1 it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance." It was so that Moses would know which God, among many, to turn to.
Now the rabbi in response could have just said that the usage is not unusual, but the rabbi instead replies that God was actually speaking of a different power in heaven, namely the Metatron, the highest of all angels, who also had the same name as God. So the early rabbis recognized the Torah taught there were different figures, all called the Lord. This correlates to what we said when we went over the Trinity in the Old Testament.
The rabbis of the First Temple often thought that the Metatron and Yahweh had equal standing, but not everyone shared the interpretation that they were the same. According to the Jewish Apocrypha, the Metatron is to be identified with the prophet Enoch, who walked with God and was taken up. In the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel, the Metatron is not identified as Enoch. Instead, it is identified as the archangel Michael.
That there is a divine figure who is also the Lord, known as the angel of the Lord.
So IP mentions just now Exodus 3:16. Well, Exodus 3:16 is a recapitulation on the idea of a previously existing unbroken monotheism for the Jews, but much biblical evidence contradicts this idea, as I've already explained. But even within the Bible, Moses' successor, Joshua, or Yusa in the Islamic tradition, says in Joshua 24:15, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord."
People often say, well, he must just be a created being because he is an angel. But remember, as we pointed out last time, the word angel in Hebrew just means messenger, not a divine figure. Human messengers were called angels in Genesis. To be an angel just meant you were a messenger. So calling this figure the angel of the Lord doesn't mean he is also one of the created angels as we know them, just a messenger from the Lord, who is also called the Lord. Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna recognizes this and says, from several texts, it is clear that the demarcation between God and his angel is often blurred. At the Exodus from Egypt, it is now God, now his angel, who goes ahead of the Israelite camp.
The reason the demarcation between God and the angel is often blurred is because the context of the Hebrew Bible did not consider Yahweh as this omnipotent being that had control over all things and superseded everything in status. For example, in Psalm 82 it says, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They will walk about in darkness. I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler.